This is my pleasure as the president of FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, to introduce this conference, which will be closed by our partner, the Vice President of Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. And we are so proud that we can deliver today a very important report on a highly relevant issue, which is exactly how are social, economic, and regional inequalities evolving in Europe over the last period. This is extremely relevant because we know that in each crisis of the recent European history, we could see inequalities increasing. Well, it started happening with the impact of hyperglobalization, then with the impact of the financial crisis, followed by the Eurozone crisis, and more recently, the COVID crisis, involving, as we know, a deep economic recession. On the top of this, we are conducting important transitions, the green transition, the digital transition, and they can also involve new kind of social inequalities. And all this is happening at the same time. The report is very important to show how this operates. Of course, there are differences when we compare member states, but we can see clearly when social inequalities, they are increasing because of a kind of a vicious circle, or when can we start reducing them with a kind of virtuous circle. So the report provides very important clues, references to pave the way for a more virtuous circle. But the big issue discussed all over the conference is what should be done at local level, national level, and European level. That's why we are so pleased to have today, first of all, the rapporteur, Professor Björn Hacker. Our congratulations for this high quality report. You are coming from HTW Berlin University, where you are Professor of European Economic Policy, but we could put together other top experts coming from these countries, and today we receive several relevant policymakers working exactly on social, regional inequalities, and we are particularly honored to count on the intervention as a keynote speaker of European Commission Nicolas Schmit. So we have everything we need to have a very lively, in-depth discussion. And I'm pleased to ask Björn Hacker, as the author of the study, to make his introduction. So Björn, you have the floor.
Thank you, President Maria Joao. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Commissioner, I'm glad to have this discussion today, and I show you some slides. I'm just sharing now. Just 1 second. So now you should see them. The topic is Unequal Europe, as Maria Joao, the president of FEPS, said, tackling social, economic, and regional divides. And as you all know, our treaty says in Article 3 that the European Union shall promote economic, social, and territorial cohesion, and it should also promote the solidarity among the member states. And what we found out in our project through 8 countries in the European Union is that these economic, social, and territorial inequalities, they are intertwined. And it is very important to realize their interdependence. And therefore, I start with a short presentation of the divergences we found out. And then, of course, I move on to some suggestions we should then later discuss about. So first of all, 8 countries I was just mentioning with varying developments. Here you see our 8 countries, and you see of course, with a quick glance, that if you look at the GDP per capita, you see here for the year 2019 that we have 4 countries above the EU average and 4 countries below the average. You can see also that the gap between Romania, here I have now the pointer, the gap between Romania and Germany is relatively large. And you see, for example, Italy and Spain, 2 countries which are nowadays, 2019, and still are below the average. They belonged before the Euro crisis, the president was just mentioning, to the countries above the average. So it was the Euro crisis who, as an impact of an economic crisis, who let these countries fall below the average. We see that we have also, if you look only at these 8 countries, strong gaps between the member states. And we know this example of Italy and Spain, that especially these 2 countries were strongly hit by the Eurozone crisis and by a very, very slow recovery. And this recovery took, I wrote it down here, until 2015-16, which was a problem, especially for Spain and Italy, when the next crisis, the next economic crisis, the pandemic hit Europe, because in these states, in Italy and also in Spain, the unemployment rates, for example, were still too high. We could look at this aspect also if you look at another indicator, the risk of poverty or social exclusion. Here, not only for several member states, but for the European Union as a whole and the Euro area, here in red. And you can see that from 2012 onwards, we have an impressive decrease of the risk of poverty or social exclusion in the European Union. In total, between 2008 and 2019, around 10 million people have been brought out of this risk, which is, of course, less than the original Europe 2020 strategy goal. The objective there was 20 million people. So half of the task was fulfilled. If you look at the Eurozone, you see here that we had a long phases of stagnation. And this was, of course, the Eurozone crisis or the aftermath of the Eurozone crisis starting here in 2011. Nearly nothing happened in these years until 2016. And it was not until 2018 when the Eurozone reached its pre-crisis level. And that's a long, long time. So we have seen 5 years of stagnation on a high level of poverty, risk of poverty or social exclusion here. And as well here, there are huge gaps between the member states of the Eurozone as well as the European Union, depending also on how they came through the economic crisis of this last decade. Let's turn to the from the supranational and member state level to the regions, because this is our topic. And here, only the 8 countries, and you should take only a short look at this. You already see that again here, we see several rifts also inside the member states. There are country-specific features which are well known. For example, Germany's east, many regions which fell apart compared to other regions in Western or Southern Germany. For example, we have in Estonia here, and we have in Romania some legacies from the socialist systems. We have in Finland and Sweden, I had to cut the countries here, I'm sorry for that. Finland and Sweden, we have rural areas, we have areas which are sparsely populated with particular socioeconomic developments. But what we found out in our tour through these 8 countries is that nevertheless, despite all the country-specific differences, the comparative analysis of the socioeconomic spatial types reveals that we have some clear patterns of regional disparities. And the first is the structural change or the change of the economic paradigm. And that means also some regional inequalities have historical roots. I mentioned socialism, for example. All 8 country studies point to an intensification of these existing inequalities over the last 20 to 30 years. And the explanation, our explanation for that is what happened in the last 20, 30 years. Well, after 30 years ago, it was the end of the Cold War. Market liberalism and globalization gained momentum, and we experienced as well sectoral shifts towards service sector societies and a world market-driven specialization in production. And this was accompanied by a redefinition of the role of the state in market activity. And the here increasingly dominant neoclassical economic theory aimed to impose few restraints, as few restraints as possible on the market and the free play of the market forces, and to prevent, of course, high government debt, especially if you think about economic monetary union. And then we found out a second thing, and this is there is a contrasting development between economically developed centers and peripheral regions. So we should distinguish not only between rich or poor regions, between north and south, east and west. We should differentiate between economically developed centers and peripheral regions. And the disparity reports, the 8 disparity reports, they show a clear dualism between advantaged regions in around metropolitan areas, that is, for example, Ile-de-France here, that is Madrid and the area of Madrid, that is, for example, Bucharest, that is Helsinki, that is Stockholm. And as well, what you cannot see here, what you can read in the single reports, also in populated areas, in middle-sized cities and commuter belts of big cities, they belong to the richest regions. For example, in southern Germany, for example, in northern Italy, for example, here in northern Spain. And then we have on the other side, we have peripheral regions. And these peripheral regions, they either have not been able to cope with all these mentioned structural change and suffered from deindustrialization, for example, or they are highly rural and dominated by agriculture. And just to name a few regions, I'm sure you know some of them, of course. For example, in Germany, the Ruhr region with its old mining industries, or for example, in Estonia, manufacturing industries in the northeast, or for example, in Romania's border regions, old socialist industries. Then in Italy, in the southern regions, industries which struggled in the last 30 years a lot, as well as in France, northeast, and many, many more. I cannot tell them all, it's all about in the reports. So these are the big problems we are seeing. And the decline of industries causes, of course, severe problems. And we have to admit that we have these economically developed centers, and on the other side, these peripheral regions. And the problem is there have been, of course, a lot of attempts to help these peripheral regions, but we realize there is a kind of vicious cycle for these peripheral regions, and it goes like this. We see that industries disappear or in some regions never existed. Then we have a concentration on low-skilled service sector, tourism, for example, or agriculture. Now, the educated people leave because they want to have their chances elsewhere, in the commuter belts, in the metropolitan areas. So we have low employment rates, social expenditure increases, we have low tax revenues. Therefore, the regions don't have enough money to invest. There are no new economic dynamics. And then many enterprises say, okay, if infrastructure is further declining, why should I go in this special region? And this vicious circle, this causes a big, big problem in many of the regions we have seen. In many of the peripheral regions, they are caught in these vicious circles. Whereas on the other side, some of the economically dynamic regions, they have a sort of virtuous circle. The other way around. People move there and enterprises move there because they say, yeah, that's good, this is working. And in the last 30 years, we have seen these concentrations in these two separate cycles. And this is not a good thing if we look all over Europe. And if we really want to have this sort of cohesion I was talking about in the beginning. And then we have to admit, the last point here, that each crisis, of course, deepens the existing socioeconomic divisions. Because if you are in a region which is doing economically well, the crisis causes you, first of all, the same problem like the others, but you are so dynamic that you can get out of the crisis much quicker than the peripheral regions. What can the EU do? Yeah, we are in this project sure that it's not only the regional level which should react on these problems. We should look differently at the European Union's role in regional policy. And this should not longer be a field of action which is determined by the main question, how much money can a region or a member state get? What we want to have is that, or what we suggest to have, is to enable the European Union to be a sort of protective buffer against globalization, against new problems we are facing, against crises, and of course against new challenges like climate change, like digitalization, like pandemics, and all the aspects it forces our economies to change. So there are two important points I like to mention here. One is the European Union should focus on cohesion instead of internal competition between the regions. What do I mean? Well, in cohesion policy, there was a, I would say, remarkable orientation in the last 20, 30 years on growth and competitiveness, which is not wrong. But what we see now is that interregional competition of the last years has made the developed regions richer and has helped to close the gap between rich and poor regions only sparsely. And on a supranational level, the European Union nowadays finds itself in a highly competitive world economy, but we should realize that there is no automatic spillover from interregional competition to achieve global competitiveness. And this is why it is important to strengthen the multidimensionality of cohesion policy. There are similar patterns of development in the regions, but there's no one-size-fits-all solution for the regions. So we should stop to believe in GDP growth and competitiveness as the only game in town. There are other objectives and ideas we should talk about. Second thing, we should develop an integrated European economic and social policy. What do I mean? First of all, we should avoid pro-cyclical developments like in the austerity policy of the euro crisis, because it made our situation, our socioeconomic situation, even worse. The economic and social consequences of a misguided crisis management contributed to the persistence of inequality, and it deepened the divisions we are seeing not only between member states but also between the regions. And this is why things like collective worker rights, guaranteed access to social insurance, the fight against child poverty, and many, many other things are very, very important, not only for the member states, but also in the regions. And this is why these things should be protected by the European Pillar of Social Rights we have since 2017. And that means that the EPSR, the European Pillar of Social Rights, needs to be legally binding. And strengthening the importance of social Europe means as well to develop more indicator-based targets for this pillar, and as well to turn European Monetary Union budget criteria into an integrated stability, growth, and social pact. This would be one idea. I close with one quote from Jacques Delors. Yeah, you might know, he said 30 years ago, you cannot fall in love with the common market. And he was right. But as you all know, at the high times of the single market completion and monetary union foundation, it was not possible to enable the social dimension of the European Union. And today, after we have faced a series of crises and see already the new challenges like digitalization, like climate change and other things, we have to admit that our member states and regions alike do need common answers. But as long as the European Union is dominated by economic integration, people might find it difficult to see what is the benefit of a transnational organization. And this is why my plea at the end of our little journey through Europe and through these regional divergences, my plea would go like, we should leave behind our old convictions in the predominance of budget policies and competition-based structural reforms in order to build a fully fledged European social model by integrating the objectives of economic, social, and territorial coherence, and of course, inner European solidarity. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, Björn. Very clear presentation of the conclusions of your report, high quality report. And now you are coming with the clear recommendations, the need for focusing on not on competition between regions, but on bringing them together and making sure that we have a comprehensive approach with economic and social policies. And then, of course, addressing the big issue, which is what will be the outcome of the European integration as it is? A machine for divergences or a machine for upward convergence? We are keeping these big questions. And now let's listen to Nicolas Schmit, European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights. You have in your hands very important instruments right now: the action plan for the European Pillar of Social Rights, the design of this European semester, the design of the recovery plans. So tell us what you want to tell us. Many thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you very much also for the introduction by Professor Hacker. And I must say this was very instructive, and your report is, in my view, extremely valuable, because it shows that in the past we missed a certain number of good opportunities to change a bit the way how Europe was built. Because I believe that from the beginning on, from the Treaty of Rome, there was an awareness that you cannot have a common market at that time without certain mechanism trying to support certain regions which might not be among the first beneficiaries of this common market. And therefore, the idea of a social fund was in the treaty. Regional policy was started immediately. So I think the awareness that you have a common market, you have competition, but there is also a strong need for corrective mechanism. And because President Delors was mentioned, I had a look on what he said about these issues. And he made a very inspiring speech in '92. And '92 was a symbolic year because it was the year of the completion of the so-called internal market. And he said, well, this was a success. It was really the moment where barriers were lowered, were reduced, and even some disappeared. So it was a success for this. But at the same time, he criticized that the integration of a more social dimension or a more social dimension of these policies were much too slow and insufficient. And at the same time, we noticed also that the internal market was very beneficiary to certain regions and did not help so much other regions. And this is confirmed finally by the study you have performed. The richer regions finally perform very well, take all the advantage out of the market, of the opening of the markets, and the disadvantaged regions may not take the same advantage. And therefore, and you mentioned it, the treaty says that we need this territorial, social, and economic cohesion to build a more solid Europe, because you cannot build a solid Europe on a Europe where the economic and social developments fall apart, and where you have certain very rich regions with a strong economic and social dynamic, and on the other hand, you have regions where finally, for different reasons, and you mentioned a few of them, you have an increase of poverty, no growth or very low growth, and no economic dynamism. And therefore, I think we are now, especially also after this pandemic, which launched a very strong solidarity program for Europe. We are now at the moment where finally there is a strong awareness again that not only the world is one, but also Europe is one. That we cannot build a solid Europe on growing disparities. We need this upward convergence. This is in the interest of our economy, and not just at the European level. It's also in the interest of our economy in the globalized world. And therefore, always mentioning globalization as some kind of an argument to say that, well, we need this only competition, and competitiveness is the key for everything. And I fully agree with Professor Hacker on that. Cannot be the right approach, because I think we need certainly competition, but we need also cooperation. And the law, by the way, his ideas were always those: we have to build Europe on competition, on cooperation, and on solidarity. So this triptych is extremely important. Now, on inequalities, because we see inequalities between member states, we see inequalities within member states, and we see also inequalities growing in our member states between people, between categories of people, very much linked sometimes also to the territorial dimension. But you can have at the same time big or growing gaps in those places where finally wealth is very much concentrated. You might also have at the same time poverty increase. And therefore, I think we have now at the European level to work on these different elements. And first, I think we are, in a way, we should be at least a union of social states. That's this idea of welfare states. And therefore, we have certainly a big responsibility for welfare at national level, but we also have a responsibility at European level. And that's the issue about how can we really sustain social protection systems in all our member states, and reducing the gaps which exist. And this is certainly has a very strong economic dimension, but it also has a social dimension. And by the way, Eurobarometer shows us that inequality in all its dimension is one of the major issues for European citizens. Even sometimes in Eurobarometers, in surveys, you will see that the idea of equality of opportunities, reducing inequality, ranks before the climate issues. And this shows that Europeans understand that rising inequality in their member state, but also between member states, might be dangerous for the whole European project. Now, just to say a word on the pandemic, because I think in the contrast with the previous economic and financial crisis. This time, everybody understood that if Europe was not able to propose a real program of solidarity, this could be a danger for the good functioning of the European economy, and especially the good functioning of the internal market. So I think here people understood that investing in solidarity was investing not just to help others, but also to help one's own economy. And that's probably at the end which made this adoption of the Recovery and Resilience Fund possible, that finally also the more reluctant member states understood that their well-being, their economic strength are depending also on other member states' development and possibilities, because we all belong to this internal market, not to speak about the monetary union. And therefore, the first measure which was taken was a program to save jobs and to save income. And this was a 100 billion program, the SURE program, which allowed all member states, because 19 of 27 member states used this facility to finance short-time work schemes. This was the first time that in such a crisis, with this dimension, all member states, also those of the poorer part of Europe, used this instrument to finance short-time work schemes. This prevented us from losing further millions of jobs, and especially would have had a very strong impact also on incomes and on the stabilizers for the European economy. So I think this is a good example how finally Europe was able to react rapidly, relatively boldly, because 100 billion euros were spent to help building up these short-time work support. Now, coming back to the recovery, it was clear also in the debate that we had to we recommended, the Commission recommended to use the money out of the 750 billion allocated to member states, and mainly also to those member states that were hit most during the crisis and due to the pandemic, that the regional imbalances should be addressed. So the social dimension, without being clearly an objective, was inherent also of this recovery package. Certainly, there was an objective for greening our economy and also promoting the digitalization of our economy. But a lot of issues were also in the social sphere. Investing more in skilling, investing in health, because we all had understood that bad health infrastructures have also a negative impact on the good functioning of our economy. Now, a few examples where we try indeed to bridge the gaps or to reduce the gaps. Certain EU initiatives which were taken on the basis, and it was mentioned, of the pillar of social rights, because the pillar of social rights offer precisely a vision of a Europe where the different social gaps are reduced. When we are talking about skills, we have this huge skills gap in our population, but also among regions. Investing in education, investing in long life learning are also the right tools to reduce these inequalities in our societies, but also between regions and between member states. So this is one of the very important targets of this Commission, investing in skills. We have adopted a skills agenda. We have adopted a skills pact involving also the private sector, but not only the private sector, also social partners. And I think this is also an extremely important element, because skills finally are one determining element in an economy, in a society where knowledge, and Maija knows very well that was already one of the core elements of the Lisbon strategy, knowledge. So to promote knowledge and to make sure that finally we can, through investing in people, investing in skills, we can also prevent these gaps increasing, and we try to reduce them. The second element, which is also very much present in the pillar of social rights, are inequalities in terms of revenue, in terms of income. And here we have proposed a directive on a framework for adequate minimum wages, because the gaps here between member states are huge. We have a gap from 1 to more or less 7 between the highest minimum wage in Europe and the lowest, and therefore it is important that better wages, starting with minimum wages, are important to first to reduce inequalities between member states, but also to finally create incentives for investing in skills, in productivity, because the only way to bridge the gaps, also the economic gaps, is increasing productivity. And with very low wages, investing not very much in people's skills, these regions, these member states will stay at a lower level, and we will not have this upward convergence we want. So minimum wage is a very important element. The second one of this income strategy is promoting social dialogue and collective bargaining. So we have here also very big differences, because in some member states we have collective agreements covering about 80, 90, even sometimes 90% of the workforce, and in others we are perhaps at 10 or 15 because the cultures are different. But we have really to promote collective agreements for establishing fairer wages. So this is the wage policy, which is also part of relaunching and redeveloping and promoting upward convergence. The third element, which is important, is youth. And here I think this is it is mentioned in your study also that certainly there are big differences among the young, especially also young people who have not the right skills, the needs. We have around 13% of young people who are not in school, not in education, not in training, not in employment. So this is something with high levels of needs, especially in poor regions, which shows that there is a very strong linkage between poor regions and high levels of young people without the right skills or not with a lot of opportunities. So I think this is the objective of our youth guarantee, to promote investing in young people, to give young people all over Europe better opportunities. And this cannot just be limited to the free circulation. And this is another issue. Well, certainly you can say, okay, there are regions which are, as you have described, not very favored, or which are declining regions, and we see a lot of movement from these regions to other more affluent regions in Europe. But this creates a negative downward spiral, because then if the young leave these regions, if the best skilled leave the regions, we will not manage to help these regions to develop again. And therefore, I think this is also on the level of youth employment, investing in youth, but also creating jobs for the young where there are not sufficient jobs. And what has been said on infrastructure, investing in infrastructure, investing certainly in skilling, helping companies to establish in these regions, which means also that you have to put into place schemes, also hiring schemes, which support the hiring of young people in these areas are for me extremely important. And we have proposed, by the way, also an instrument called EASE, which promotes also not only job creation, but also hiring subsidies in those regions where finally there are not enough jobs. The third element, which is also extremely important, is fighting poverty, because poverty is also a vicious circle, as we know, and we have adopted a European Child Guarantee for supporting the poor children, making better opportunities for every child. Because we all know that if you are not doing this, if you are not supporting poor children, and this may be in poor regions, but it may be also in rich regions, as it has been shown that even where the most affluent metropolitan centers, where there is high growth and high wealth, there are also, on the other hand, poor people. And so we have really to take care of these growing gaps, inequalities. And here, the European Child Guarantee seems to me a very important tool to reduce child poverty. By the way, in the Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan, which was adopted in Porto, we have set a new objective of reducing the number of people at risk of poverty by 15 million. And it has been shown that we were quite successful in a certain period to decrease the number of people at risk of poverty, and that there is a risk now that we will have new problems due to the pandemic. And there is also a big difference between countries concerning the reduction of poverty. Now, poverty also means how can we help people finally to find a way back in society? And I think believing that people who are in a total in a situation of having no means at all, of really having very, very low level of income, that this is the right way to bring them back to the labor market, to bring them back into society, to help children also. I think this is an illusion, and therefore we will come up with a recommendation on minimum income. But minimum income alone is not the solution. We need an active welfare state, a socially active state, to help these people also, once they have this minimum income, to find a way back to the labor market. We are at a moment where we have all over Europe shortages in labor force. So this is a unique opportunity now to invest in people's skills, to support them, but also to help them to find the way back in society, and so to by that way also to reduce poverty and inequalities. Perhaps one word about because you showed the differences between the Eurozone countries and the overall European Union. And we have seen that fiscal consolidation had also negative impact on income distribution, and inequality and poverty due to the financial crisis and to the fiscal consolidation, or some would say austerity policies, had a negative social impact. And by the way, there is an IMF study of 2018, which has come to the conclusion that real convergence of per capita income levels has not occurred after the creation of the Eurozone. So the Eurozone finally has advantaged the richer parts in Europe, the richer countries in Europe, and income convergence has stagnated. So the idea that the euro could be a convergence instrument has not worked as we expected. And this shows that finally this euro system has some, say, lacks in order to that finally the upward convergence has not taken place. And this has happened at different levels, including also at the level of concentration of wealth, concentration of economic activity, and especially also in terms of productivity. Now, just to finish here, now you have mentioned two major challenges. I think these challenges have a lot of opportunities, but also some dangers in terms of inequality, in terms of increasing gaps. And the first one would be the green transition, because we have decided for good reasons that the Green Deal is really the project for the coming decades, for the obvious reason of climate change, and that Europe has to rebuild its economy through this Green Deal and organize the green transition. And this has obviously an impact on regions which are still very much depending on high emission industries, high CO2 emission industries, and we have to really promote the restructuring of these regions. And this should be really the opportunity not to have the same errors we had during the previous restructuring, more due to also technological changes and to globalization. So we really have to make this green transition a fair and just transition. And this means that we have to make sure that these regions, which have to give up coal, which have to rebuild certain industries, be it in the chemical industries or just the automotive industry, that we will indeed give them the possibility to have a smooth transition, and in terms of time, rapid transitions. It's not some regions were mentioned which were in the beginning of this last century very prosperous regions, and then from the 60s, 70s on, declining regions. And finally, what happened? No investment in infrastructure, no new industries coming, because there is this vicious circle of decline. And this has to be avoided this time in relation to the green transition. And the same thing has to happen for the digital, because the digital offers probably new opportunities also to those peripheral region, because they can be better connected to the overall economic context. But there are two major conditions. First, they have to be connected. So we have to make sure that they have the right investments. And this is part also of our Recovery and Resilience Fund, that the connections in Europe have to be made available for all regions, but also for all people. So that's the skills aspect, investing in digital skills, and at the same time investing also in insufficient connections of certain parts of Europe. And the third issue linked to digital is that we cannot allow that the digital economy opens new business models which finally produce poverty, exclusion, and do not assure the social protection which the overall economy might have. And that's platform economy. Some activities in the platform economy, we have really to do something about social protection, labor laws, labor rights in the platform economy. And platform economy is mainly centered, by the way, in the richer parts, in the metropolitan parts. So the risk that here, again, there are gaps between populations, between groups, is given, and therefore we will come up with a legislation on the rights of platform people working for platforms. So these are a few elements, I think, where indeed Europe has reacted through this crisis differently. This is a very positive evolution. We have now to build on this. The recovery and resilience facility is now through the national plans put into place. There is a need for investment, and the point is that this investment has not just to be centered on the richer parts. It has really to be distributed all over Europe, and especially in those territories which are identified for being disadvantaged regions, to close the gaps, to give these regions new possibilities to keep people there, because otherwise we have this brain drain, which we have, by the way. One of the major issues are the demographic issues all over Europe, but especially in those regions that have lost big parts, big numbers of their population, and mainly the young. So I think having this integrated policies, I just absolutely agree with what Professor Hacker has said, having these integrated policies between the economic dimension, the social dimension, the territorial dimension, and bringing this together, we can indeed have policies which promote upward convergence and which reduce also the gaps and make Europe stronger all over, stronger also in the global competition. Thank you.
Very well. I think we should thank our commissioner for a very comprehensive and inspiring intervention, addressing many issues. We could benefit from this. Now we need to adapt our schedule. And I think it's no longer possible to have the interactive dialogue we'd like to have, but well, things that sometimes are like that. The intervention was extremely important and useful for our purpose. So I will just ask our rapporteur to make a short comment, and then I will make myself also a very short comment to wrap up, because then we need to go to the panel. We have a very good range of speakers coming to a panel. So Björn, tell us your views shortly. You have a few minutes.
Yeah, I think Commissioner Schmit, I can agree, of course, on many of the aspects you're mentioning. And it's good to hear that the Commission has understood to compare these different crises, that the last crisis is the Euro crisis or the austerity policy done there, that this concept was in many aspects maybe not the right concept to close the gaps we have already seen before the crises in Europe. And that we have in Europe the problem that we have big success in territorial and social cohesion, but if such a big crisis like global financial crisis, Euro crisis, pandemic comes, that we could lose all the positive aspects if we do a wrong policy there. And therefore, I'm of course an absolutely fan of this Next Generation EU package and all the policies you mentioned there and the European Pillar of Social Rights. And I think it's also with the pandemic, with this severe crisis, easier to understand in the richer regions. Here in Germany, for example, in this country, because German politicians, many politicians in the Euro crisis said, well, this is a crisis in Greece, this is a crisis in Spain, in Portugal, this is not a crisis of Northern Europe. But it is not true, because it was systemic. And I think in this crisis now, in the pandemic, it's easier to understand for everybody that, well, the pandemic is not stopping at the borders. The pandemic is everywhere in Europe, and it has to be fight in every region and in every country. And the things we realize, this double polarization, social and territorial polarization we have seen in the 8 countries, is not only a problem of poor countries or of countries who have been hit by the last two crises very, very strongly. It is also a problem. We see the same patterns in the rich countries. And therefore, I mentioned, for example, Germany, I mentioned Finland, I mentioned Sweden, I mentioned France, some richer member states. If you look at the per capita income, they also have a lot of problems. There's one thing I would like to ask as well, the Commissioner. Regional policy is increasingly connected to our economic governance framework over the European semester. And my question would be, I really like the approach of doing more of social policy now, of investment policies by the Commission. But I have the fear that all these social policy, investment policy attempts, they end on the desks of the finance ministers and the ECOFIN, and that the finance ministers say, after the pandemic, we have no money to finance all these plans. You were mentioning the minimum wage initiative and child guarantee and many, many other things. So how can we be sure that we change, how can we change this economic governance framework? My idea was, if you look at in the European Monetary Union at the Stability and Growth Pact, which is out of order, one can say in the moment, but I mean, there are many voices who say we should look at the Stability and Growth Pact, we should work with it. Why not transferring this Stability and Growth Pact into a Stability, Growth and Social Pact? Wouldn't that be an idea to get these social aspects also for the regions as well as for the member states more importance?
Thank you very much, Björn Hacker, for these last remarks. We could have a very important interaction between all of us, but now, because we need to move to the panel, let me also wrap up this discussion in the following terms. Look, what is at stake is for us to be clear on how can we make sure that the European project, European space, is a space for upward convergence, for reducing inequalities and not to increase inequalities. Because if it is a space to increase inequalities, there is no future for the European project. It's as simple as that. So yes, according to the long tradition, we need to update our concept of European policies for cohesion. We had a very rich presentation of priorities by our Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights. We have new insights coming from the report presented by Björn Hacker. Let me just make a very few remarks for our going work for the future. It was clear that in this report, we could also highlight what can be done at national level. And let me just underline things which should be changed. We need to have active taxation policy, progressive taxation policy to make redistribution at national level. This can help a lot. And we need to have a state with the room of maneuver to invest in the future, to update infrastructures, access to skills, and strengthening welfare systems. But there is a second important process, which is the so-called European semester, where, yes, we need to have a more positive interplay between economic and social policies. The starting point for this is a new concept of prosperity beyond GDP, focusing on sustainable development and translating these into a new set of priorities. And this also should change our concept of reforms to be coupled with investments. But then there is a last point, is the role of the so-called European buffers. Because now we have a toolbox, structural funds, globalization fund, this exceptional recovery fund, including the transition, and this very interesting instrument, which was created already by the hands of Nicolas Schmit, the SURE. We need to see how all these can interplay in the future. Also in the light of the upcoming challenges, because I think Nicolas Schmit is right, the current green transition and digital transition, they are bringing new kind of inequalities. And we need to address them with updated tools. So I will just, to conclude, leave a last question, which is the following. Cohesion policy was introduced in the European project since the Treaty of Rome. But with the invention of the European Pillar of Social Rights, we can perhaps give a new basis for the cohesion policy, which is not only supporting lagging behind regions, but making sure that all European citizens, because they are European citizens, they can count on the same floor of fundamental social rights. And the European Union as a responsibility to make this happen. So this could be a new approach, a new foundation for the cohesion policy. But I'm sure this will bring us to a new conference we can organize very soon. So many thanks for this sequence of very, very important interventions. Many thanks, Björn Hacker. Many thanks, Nicolas Schmit. Now I'm handing over to Philipp Fink, the moderator of our panel. So Philipp, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And hello from me. My name is Philipp Fink from Stockholm. I'm the director of the Nordic Office of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung here in Stockholm. And Björn and I think Commissioner Schmit will join us also in this panel discussion. What we'll be doing here is we'll be moving perhaps from the European level and going down to the individual countries a bit to look at certain cases. And I'd like to welcome our panelists for the next 45 minutes. On one hand, we have Constanze Krehl. Constanze Krehl is the member of European Parliament and for Saxony and Germany, and she's also a member of the Parliament's Commission for Regional Development. Thank you very much, Constanze, for being with us. Then we have Constanze, Cristina Rat. Hello, Cristina Rat. Cristina is a sociologist at the Babiš Balej University in Cluj-Napoca and is the author or the main author of the Romanian Disparity Report. And then we move on to Helsinki, and there we have Maija Mattila. Maija Mattila is researcher with the Kalevi Social Foundation in Helsinki and was also one of the main authors of the Finnish Disparity Report. I'm afraid that I also have to announce that we have a cancellation. Unfortunately, Giuseppe Provenzano won't be joining us today. He had a short-term last-minute cancellation, sorry about that. But I'm sure that our panelists will fill his role just as well. Well, I'd like to start with the example of Finland. And Maija Mattila, when we look at the Finnish and Swedish reports, outsiders may be a little startled by the extent of inequality in countries which obviously are and were and have been famous for their equal societies and welfare states. Zooming in on Finland, how is regional inequality discussed in Finland? And more importantly, what are the measures to counteract the regional divide? And are they currently being discussed, and how are they being implemented in Finland? And also, if I can just add that, how is the role of the EU being discussed in this debate?
Thank you, Philip, and thank you for the very good speeches before me. Very interesting topic and very good report also by Professor Hacker, and thank you. Very nice to be here tonight. The regional disparities in Finland are a constant topic. It's a well-known topic. It's quite vividly discussed in Finland. One of the driver of the topic in here is the long distances. People are wondering how much time does it take for an ambulance to get here where I live? Are there enough police personnel to prevent crime around where I live? How long a journey do you have to take to reach a hospital to give a birth, and so forth? And then another dimension in the disparities, regional disparities discussion here in Finland is the depopulation of the countryside. Like, how do we retain schools in areas where there are only few babies born each year? And the disparity in Finland between rural areas and the cities is quite steep. And indeed, the rural areas are emptying, whereas the cities, and especially the capital region around Helsinki, is filling in quite fastly. So there are questions about how do we provide, for instance, healthcare and social services to people in general, and especially to the aging population in regions where there are no more taxpayers, or fewer and fewer taxpayers all the time. So I would say that the discussion about disparities, regional disparities in Finland, is more about ensuring equal access to services than it is about thinking that people in the countryside would be worse off or poorer than people in the cities. So it's really about the equality of access to quality services. And I think I can't highlight this enough in the Finnish context. And I think that also in Finland, what is politically interesting here is that we have a quite strong center party which has agrarian roots. And it's much stronger in Finland than it is in other European countries. And this party kind of owns the discussion about regional disparities. And I think it would be important to also have other parties to come into this discussion and kind of try to also take this topic so that they can address this question about regional disparities. Now about the measures that have been taken here in Finland to address this question about disparities, regional disparities in Finland. First of all, there is a social and healthcare reform that was actually accepted last summer after the Finnish report on this project was published. So this reform took action in summer, or actually it was voted for in the parliament, and then the law will come into force beginning of next year. What we are suggesting in the report, in the Finnish report, me and the other writers, which are plenty, is that we should accept the differentiation of municipalities, because we have municipalities that have quite, and not just quite, but extremely wide range of tasks assigned to them. So far also the social and healthcare, which will now be moved from some 300 municipalities to the 13 welfare regions or districts. So we should accept the differentiation of municipalities, that we don't have to have in every single 300 municipalities the exact same services, because now they should be there, the services, but in effect they are not, because the municipalities can't handle these tasks that are assigned to them in the law, but they don't have the resources to keep up the services. So we should think more about the equality of people rather than the equality of administrative structures like municipalities in Finland. And this is a big question. And I would say that the Centre Party also kind of owns the discussion from the municipalities' perspective, but not necessarily from the people perspective. And there is a parliamentary working group also for sparsely populated areas here in Finland. The group has suggested measures such as boosting tourism in the sparsely populated areas, making sure that in order to go to school, kids don't need to go very far from their homes, and flexibility to living and working conditions, which we also proposed in our report.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And just quickly, what role does the EU and the EU policies also play in discussion and the debate in Finland?
I mean, when I look at the public discussion, I would say that not a very big role. Because there are the EU structural funds, which are for sure very important for regions. But if you look at the public discussion, the EU is not very much discussed about. And I would say that it would do good for the EU if it could kind of appear as an actor that tries to ensure the social rights of people as well. And not just the free market, as I think both Professor Hacker and Commissioner Schmit were saying before. But I would say that in the public discussion, not much, unfortunately.
Okay. Cristina, the situation in Romania as a former socialist country, so it's a different case altogether compared to Finland and Sweden on the book. But what influence has the transition process in Romania actually had on the development of regional disparities in your country?
So clearly, this is not a socialist legacy, because socialism was a very centralized system that actually did a lot to level down regional inequalities, including population mixes in terms of ethnicity and in terms of status. But rather, it's a problem of how the transformations were managed after the fall of state socialism, which I agree that in the 80s was a disaster. But what happened in the 90s was a very bad management of the transformations. And actually, if we look at the lagging behind regions report from 2017 by Cristina Rat, at that time Commissioner for Regional Policy in the EU, we see that Eastern European regions are more in the low income than in the low growth category. And what happens is rather how we invest in the economy, how we use the GDP growth in order to enhance the overall welfare of the country. And I think that there was a bad model in that sense. And Professor Hacker illustrated that very well in terms of having some so-called growth goals in which we invest and expecting that there will be a trickle-down effect in which inequalities will level down because of the growth in some centers. This did not happen. Actually, gross capital formation was much concentrated in certain areas, and other regions were simply lacking gross capital formation that then contributed to the peripherization of the country. And now we have almost 4 million Romanians working abroad. So I think that the transformation process was very badly managed. Now we have an economic model that is not sustainable because, as Commissioner Schmit rightly said, digital transformation and the transition to a green economy, which I fully agree it should be our priority, will create new forms of inequality. And I don't know whether Romania is prepared for that, but this is clearly a concern. And in this sense, I think that we should think at two very important issues. First, we need to empower lagging behind regions to have not only the economic capacity, but also the know-how of how to invest and how to use the available European funds. And second, how to encourage the regions that are better off, that are growing fast, to redistribute toward the other regions, as it happens, for example, in Poland with the Januszek tax. So clearly, at the level of individuals, progressive taxation is a must. Thinking about how we deal with business process outsourcing, with the growing, maybe slowly growing, but still growing service sector in the country, that is another area of concern. And we should remember that 23% of the population of Romania is employed in agriculture. So agriculture provides 4.5% of our GDP, which is much more than in other European countries, still a small percentage. But in terms of green transition, I think that agriculture and the potential that Romania has in this respect is something that should not be ignored. And in terms of child poverty, because Commissioner also mentioned the European Child Guarantee, I think that we should bear in mind that child poverty did not decrease, but it's rather about a decrease in terms of work deprivation, which is very low in Romania. We have material deprivation and income inequality, and very high rates of child poverty, like 1 in 3 children. impoverished. And here we have huge problems with rural areas, with the situation of Roma ethnic groups living in segregation. And we should acknowledge these problems, and we should address early school leaving at a very early age. It's not about people lacking access to university education, but rather about school exclusion happening at a very early age due to structural factors that are very much present, especially unfortunately, in Roma communities. So I think that we should think about these problems and understand the need to build on the strengths of the country. So I very much appreciated that at this report, which I had the opportunity to collaborate with Stefan Fina and Bastian Heider, that we laid the emphasis not on poverty and on income deprivation, but we laid the emphasis on resources and needs for development. And I think that that was a strength of this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristina. Now, Constanze, if it's okay, could I just ask Commissioner Schmit a question? I'm just not sure how long he'll be able to stay with us. So if at the opportunity, I just ask him quickly. So, Commissioner Schmit, how can these? I mean, we have like two different countries, obviously also experiencing inequalities, which are also always seen from a national perspective to a certain degree, but obviously with two very different needs. How do you tailor these programs to these individual needs, these individual cases?
Well, I think this is done. Obviously, I am responsible for the European Social Fund, and certainly we try to tailor the measures of being financed by the European Social Fund to the needs of the different countries and the different regions, because regions play an important role here. It's not that just giving the money to the central government. There is also a regional dimension in this. So certainly we try to take into account the different needs, the different situations. Certainly the situation in Finland, in the peripheral regions in Finland are very different from those existing in Romania. We have in Finland, nevertheless, a very strong social protection and welfare state. We have in Romania high problems with the communities, which are a lot disadvantaged. We try to target, especially also these communities who are concentrated also in some specific regions. So I think that we are certainly trying to differentiate our measures, our policies in respect, in relation to the differences existing in the member states.
Okay, thank you. Constanze Krehl, as a member of the Committee for Regional Development, and now we're back to structural funds and regional policies, but obviously it's difficult to distinguish both programs and measures. Do you see that there's room to maneuver to tailor the programs which are currently being offered on the European level more to the realistic needs in the countries themselves?
Yeah, thank you very much for your invitation. And I'm not only a member of the regional committee, I'm the rapporteur for the future cohesion policy already a second time. And so I know very well the long history of cohesion policy. And to tell you the truth, what Professor Hacker and our Commissioner Nicolas Schmit raised in their speeches, I think most of the ideas are already in the future cohesion policy starting with this year. Unfortunately, we could not finish the negotiations on time because of the corona pandemic. And we decided in June, finally, the results of the negotiations. It was the parliament which really insisted that every region can participate in the cohesion policy, and Nicolas Schmit knows very well the debates and the fights inside the Commission because not everybody was happy with cohesion policy, and there were some commissioners every time telling us or trying to tell us that cohesion policy is an old-fashioned policy. But I think if you look now to the results, what we negotiated, then we face the challenges of a Green Deal, even if the proposal came long before on the desk of the Parliament, before the Green Deal was proposed. Or the problem of the digital renovation of the EU, it is also part of the future cohesion policy. And I think if you look in the construction of the future cohesion policy, then a lot of the question you raised already in the beginning could be answered. It is never one solution for everybody. It is every time the region who can look what they want to develop in their region, what is necessary to do this. We only say you have to invest 30% of the whole budget for Green Deal. You have to invest a special amount for the digitalization. You have to invest in the social pillar, and you can link much more in a much more flexible manner the funds under each other to make really solutions for every region. But what is necessary is that the regions have an idea and have a plan. Without an idea what we could do, and this is not only, oh, we are a rural area, we have to develop our farmers and have to give education to our farmers and have to support the farmers, but you have to think about new possibilities. I was, for example, in Malta last week, as you probably know, and we had a discussion in Gozo where they were very open that I proposed them, please use the knowledge from the corona pandemic that it's not necessary to work in an enterprise in a big city, but you can do this from at home. Of course, you have to then to clarify which social rights these home workers can have then. But these new possibilities gives the rural areas a completely other possibility for a future development. But you have to think about this, you have to discuss this. And the basis for these possibilities, I think they are offered in the future cohesion policy with a better partnership principle. I think with not enough budget, especially for the social funds, because the ESF Plus got a lot of more on tasks and duties to do, but not, from my point of view, not enough budget for these challenges, because what we have for the child guarantee, that is Nicolas, I think you know this much better than me, that we need much more money. But finally, it's not only the money which is necessary, it is also the participation of the people in the ground to collect ideas, and hopefully the member states can accept that we reduced really our European bureaucracy in the future cohesion policy. It makes it much more simpler. But now the member states have to follow. We have every time the difficulty. The European cohesion policy is only for co-financing of projects in a different way, from 30% to 95%. European money, but for the rest it's national money or regional money, and for these they create bureaucracy in addition to that what the European Union is asking for, and to find a way to minimize this complexity of the whole system. That would be great. I think we made the steps in the right direction, but the member states have to fulfill their duties as well. But I'm a little bit angry. It starts already with the proposal from the Commission, is that we don't have in this whole package of cohesion policy the fund for rural development. And when I see if this fund would be inside the cohesion policy, we could have a strategic planning together with the Fund for Rural Development, the Regional Fund, and the Social Fund. Now it's divided. And I'm not sure if the member states are ready to use this money for the development of rural areas, because it's not only farming. Most of the member states will use this money only for supporting the farmers. And this is not a rural area, especially when we are challenging the climate change. We have to look what is possible to how we can support rural areas, that more people stay there, that more people go into rural areas, that they have a job, that they can earn money, that they have the infrastructure for education, that you have a mobility infrastructure, which is a smart one. It's not the big buses have to go everywhere. We have to think about this development, but therefore we need as well a very close connection. And unfortunately, the former commission was not able to tackle this problem, and now it's divided. Now the commission comes with a new proposal for the development of on rural areas, which is nice, but without money. I can only hope that we can find in the next years a possibility really to connect the development on rural areas with the cohesion policy in a much better way, and then we can improve this territorial cohesion much better if we can use both of this. And Nicolas Schmit is completely right when he said it's not only necessary to look to the economic growth, we have to link this with the social development, but also with the territorial development. And I'm coming from an East German region. I know what this means, that you are part of a less developed region. We started in the beginning of the 90s with less than 75% of the average of the EU GDP. Now all regions are in the transition region or even better developed regions. That shows for me that it is really possible to come to a development, and I can see same system of development, for example, as well in Poland. That's why Poland now will get less money than in the last period. But I see on the other side, the other regions. Italy is one of the prominentest examples, because Italy is a member state of the European Union from the very, very beginning. But the difference between the northern part of Italy and the southern part of Italy, they are immense. There is, of course, development in South Italy. That's not the question, but the disparities are the same one like 30, 50 years ago. And therefore, I think we need a better communication between successful projects in cohesion policy, successful strategies in cohesion policy. It's not only a single project which is helpful, but it's a strategy where you want to go with the region. What do you want to support, and which ways you can go? I think the new cohesion policy can be helpful in this way. And I think the 330 billion of euros for the next 7 years, it's not the dream of the parliament, but I think it is really a good basis for a stable work in the future. I think we have to think about the situation of old industrial regions. I think Nicolas Schmit raised the point, the car industry, the old chemical industry. We do need these industries in the future, because it's not only a resource for labor market, it's also a resource for the economy and the development of the whole European Union. But these industrial regions often are situated in better developed member states, and they don't get so much support from the cohesion funds. And the Just Transition Fund is a good idea for such issues, but we need, of course, then as well much more money for this. These, I think, in the moment it's 40 billion. It's really not enough to change the whole energy industry in Poland, Romania, and all the other countries. And the car industry in the whole European Union. We have chemical industry in a lot of member states, and some more problems, steel production, and so. And I think this is our task. What we have, where we have to think about how to support in future these special regions.
Okay. If I could just thank you very much, Constanze, for this overview. Commissioner Schmit, I believe you have to go to your next meeting, and thank you very much for joining us and for giving us your insights. Thank you very much. Björn, I have to take you in here. Constanze, basically, it was the summary between, if I could summarize what you just briefly said, it's the importance for success is the interplay of different issues, as Commissioner Schmit always has said, is the combination between different policy fields and objectives. And the other issue, which I found also very important, was what you just said, was the focus on the regional and local capacities and capabilities to devise a vision, to devise a plan, and to make the case. And the other issue which I found interesting was the problem you just mentioned earlier on with the rural development plans or the rural development funds being supported by a different policy framework and not part of the cohesion measures in general. And your argument now at the moment that old industrial or deindustrialized areas should also be in the focus or more on the focus because they're situated in more developed European states. Björn, what's your take?
Yeah, well, thanks, Philip. If we now listen to Maija and Cristina, we heard that the differences between Finland and Romania are, of course, immense. And this is why I said there is no, and many of the other speakers that took the same quote, we cannot speak of a one-size-fits-all policy we will find in the Europe. Constanze Krehl said that we need really to look at the differences between the regions. Nevertheless, there are some similar patterns. And Constanze Krehl is also right that she says that now in this new these new criteria, they added, and especially the European Parliament added a lot of many important objectives like digitalization, climate change, social policy, but also the criteria like youth unemployment, level of education, climate change, migration and integration, which haven't been in cohesion policy before or not at that scale, because before we looked all the time at GDP or GDP per capita and only a few other criteria. And what we found out in the country reports is indeed that these other criteria, they are so important to have an answer to these differentiated countries, to these differences between the countries, to the differences between the regions. Some regions, Philip, you just mentioned, who had problems with deindustrialization, others who never had industries and had agriculture. There in Spain, for example, vast areas in some parts where there never was huge industrial plants, but they worked with agriculture there, and now with automatization and with the change of agriculture, they lost many jobs, and therefore we need something new. But I would agree with Constanze Krehl here as well. The structural funds and the regional funds and all these funds, and also Next Generation EU, they cannot transform whole Europe. And we are not a common state, so many of the things are in the should be done by the member states and the regions itself. So what the European Union can do is give the funds and give a framework. And with the framework, this was my question before, I have always a fear if we enter or come into the next crisis, that there might be some finance ministers who say, okay, but now we don't have any more the money to finance some sort not these funds. It's not about the funds. It's about other policies, for example, social policies, regional policies, policies to invest, which are really important if your economy is in a downturn moment. And we have seen that just a few years ago in the Euro crisis. It was not a good idea to impose austerity in the midst of a crisis in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, and the other countries. And I learned that Commissioner Schmit and other members of the European Commission, they understood. And I mean, the European Parliament, for example, already in the last crisis, had been in the camp of those criticizing the austerity policies with its majority. But I have always the fear that we turn back, and now we have the special situation that that all the member states in this pandemic, they invested a lot. But still, or already, there are the voices saying, okay, this will come to an end at a certain point. And this is why I was talking not only about the funds, but also about the frameworks these funds are operating in. And this framework, like Maria Joao said, is made by the European semester. And we have to talk about the European semester. We have to talk about the European Stability and Growth Pact and some other instruments.
Thank you, Björn. Constanze, I'd like to bring one question into which Maija, the point Maija made earlier on, the fact that the EU isn't playing a large role in the debate in Finnish inequalities, for instance. I think, Cristina, if I'm right, I think the situation is quite similar in Romania as well. Like the EU is not seen as an actor or as somebody who is, or an organization which heavily influences, obviously, the development paths and the budgets of the regions. How can that be addressed, Constanze?
Yeah, this is not a problem of the cohesion policy. There you have to inform every time, but it is, from my point of view, a problem that we don't have a European public. It is, we are the European Union. Björn Hacker said this. We are not one state. We are a union of 27 member states, and in the moment we have I think in almost every member state a problem of renationalization, and there a debate about European Union and the influence of European Union in the public in the public life is often not so easy. I'm feeling that it depends from the different governments. It depends from the civil society, and it depends which question you raise. On climate change, everybody knows this should be a European fight to fulfill the Paris Agreement, for example. But on the other side, there's no discussion which instruments the European Union gives the member states to solve the problems. But on the other side, Friday for Future, this is a European, not only European, a worldwide movement. Of course, it is famous. Everybody knows what they want to have and what they want to deal with. But this could be a platform, for example, for European debates as well. I can only hope that, as you probably know, everybody, we had just election in Germany, and that in our member state, hopefully we will have a progressive government in the future, and there will be, I think, a better platform to speak about European developments, because nobody can fight against climate change in a single member state or in a single region. We have to do this together, and but we have to do a lot of work. That is also clear. And sometimes I'm wondering, when a national minister, I think in every member state, tells them, the European Union has done this and this, and they think that nobody knows that they were part of the decision. That is, this problem is not a new one. It's an old one, but we need in this situation where we are at the moment, much more discussion on a European level in the member states as well.
Okay, yeah. You mentioned it. We had the German elections, which went quite well, and but there was one actually something which I think was perhaps a little underrepresented in the analysis. It was the situation which we saw in Saxony and in Thuringia as well, is that there still is a high degree of voter preference for the AfD. A lot of people voted for right-wing populist parties. Now, this is I think we kind of looked at it as the downside on this whole discussion on regional disparities, that there is something there which seems to be fueling this sentiment and support for non-democratic movements. So the question is, like, what we try to look at, what the socio-economic realities of life in these regions as well. And so basically, what's it like to live in those areas seen to be or deemed to be left behind? And so what do you, for instance, Maija, see are the effects of an uneven growth path in Finland on the democratic institutions and the processes in Finland? So, like, the role of the right-wing populist party, and can this be linked to the country's uneven development?
I mean, I think it can. If you think about the former leader of the Finns party, which used to be a populist party, but nowadays it's a radical right party, far right party, more than populist party. But when it was under the leader Timo Soini just a few years ago, he was very vocal about indicating the difference between elites living in central Helsinki and the ordinary people living all around Finland. So he evoked the traditional division between the elites and the people, and also attached it to the regional divide, I would say. So there is a link between this, but I would like to also remind that the core supporter base for the radical right parties is not the poorest, it's not the worst off, it's actually the middle class, which is anxious about not being the middle class anymore, but falling back to the lower class and to the poverty. But instead of taking it to those who are rich and who have the resources in life, they are taking it out to those who have even less than they do, in terms of, for example, people who live on social benefits. So I would think that as important as it is to take care of those who are the worst off and the poor, and also try to eradicate poverty, of course, that's important. I think it's also important to address the status anxious middle class that is afraid of falling back. And in that case, you have to take, I was taking up the services before, so I think that you have to take care of the services, because that's how you show to the middle class that there is value to their tax money. And they feel that they are not only paying into the public funds, but they are also receiving good education, they are also receiving good health care, social care, and so forth. So I think ensuring equal access to services is definitely one piece of the solution. And also what Commissioner Schmit was saying about the wages and collective bargaining, I would say that this is important too, to take care of not just the minimum wage, but also the progress of wages of the middle class that are not necessarily the poorest in this class, but others as well. So if you want to address the question about the rise of the radical right, I think this is something that you need to address. And of course, there are other issues that relate to the inequality question at large, but this is the thing that I think is important when you look at the success, which is diminishing probably a little bit as it did in Germany, for example. But if you're looking at the success of the radical right, for example, in Finland, it is quite scary. And this is something that definitely needs to be addressed.
Cristina,
Philip, can I say
yes, of course.
a short remark to Saxony and Thuringia, because I come from Saxony.
Yes.
I will ask for a party-free Republic of Leipzig because we don't have the AfD success in Leipzig, but good. No, but I think it is really a mixture of very difficult, different influences that the AfD is so successful, especially in Saxony and Thuringia. I think and it is not the economic success of the region. Saxonia and Thuringia are the most developed regions in East Germany. And if you look, for example, to Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, which is the less developed East German region, in the last years, they could halven the percentages for the AfD in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. And we have in Saxony a doubling of the results for the AfD. And I think that's why what Nicolas Schmit said, education, and not only the knowledge, how I have to add 2 figures or something like that, political demographic education, the discussion to learn to speak with each other, to communicate, all these are parts of a normal development, democratic development in the region. I think there we made mistakes, and maybe as well in other regions, it's a kind of the same situation. And what the Chancellor yesterday on the 3rd of October, the day of the unification of Germany, said in Halle that she is missing even 30 years or the 31 year after reunification, the respect for the Eastern German biographies. This is as well part of the problem, that it solves, it's not everything, but these are part. And I think, for example, in Romania, where you have so big difficulties to integrate the Sinti and Roma, for example, it is not only as a thing of, do I have enough budget to organize projects? It's how I can integrate these groups into to the society with the acceptance, with no discrimination. And so I think we have as well to deal with the people who are going back to pure nationalism in the future. And I think we could address something also from the cohesion funds to support the development in a more democratic way. But we made in East Germany also in the last years a lot of mistakes, and we have to pay a high price now. But this is it's not only a European problem. It is a European
no. I never
on one side, but it's also a regional problem.
It's a strange. So many different possible factors flow into trying to explain this development, and that's why I just wanted to say, Cristina, do you have similar developments? Do you see similar issues in Romania?
I think that indeed, not only those living in the lagging behind regions or those who are impoverished in the more developed regions are feeling disappointed by those who were members of the old strong parties, and now they find their voice in these populist parties. But I think there is another development which is just as concerning, and that is showing some political decisions as technocratic decisions, as decisions that are neutral from the political point of view, and they are based on some sort of knowledge. For example, moving all social insurance contributions from the employer to the employee. That happened in 2017 in Romania. That was a major shift in the social insurance system and was not discussed as a political question, but as a technocratic decision. How you have a country with such large inequalities and still have a flat tax, 10% of income. So, and this is again presented as a technocratic, as a technical solution to the country's economic development, not as a political question. So I think that indeed putting the proper political emphasis on political questions and not presenting them as some technical questions that should be solved by experts from the World Bank, from the European Commission, those people who are neutral from political point of view. Of course, they are not neutral. This is about politics. So I think that kind of discussion is still very much limited in Romania, understanding what politics is, not only political parties, but what is to be political and what is a political decision. So I think we are not at that point, unfortunately, today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very important point, the depoliticization of politics and the use of TINA. There is no alternative. Something which rings very, very familiar if you look at the austerity discussions back after the financial crisis. Björn, please join our second round.
Yeah, on this point, I would like to add, I think there's an empty position, one can say, to help those people who do not trust anymore, for example, in the market, and who not trust anymore in elitist politics, one could say. And of course, Constanze Krehl is absolutely right. There's not one singular factor who can explain and could help bring these people back. But what I mean with an empty position is an institution which can say, okay, we protect you against new challenges. And this is why we are talking in this panel about the European Union. Yeah, I think the European Union could better use its market power, could better use its investment possibilities, could better use its governance framework to shape globalization, not to surrender to its imperatives. And we have a lot of challenges, be it climate change, be it digitalization, be it the pandemics, trade conflicts, economic crises, all the things we have mentioned here. And I think for these 450 million people, seeing in the European Union, seeing the protective function of the European Union, as I said before, a buffering effect against globalization, I think this could, for some people, maybe help that to know there is an institution, this European Union, which helps us not to surrender to these imperatives of globalization, and is there to moderate all these changes, the change in the economy, the changes in the society, and so on and so forth. Normally, of course, this should be done as well on the regional level, on the member states level. But for the European Union, I think this could be a chance as well to be in this position as a buffer against the globalization and the coming challenges.
Thank you, Björn. Constanze, I believe you have to go. Would you like to say 2 words on that, or?
No, I completely agree with Björn Hacker. He's right. We should do this.
Wonderful.
Good. I have to leave. Maybe we see each other in the next round as well for a new.
Thank you very much for taking part.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. That's about it for our discussion round. We originally promised you the Vice President of the FES to wrap up today's event, but I'm afraid Daniela Kolber had to cancel her appearance. That's why you have to settle with me. I talked to David, and David said I should do it, so I'll do it. I'll try my best to try and wrap up this discussion, but also to wrap up our project, because as you know, this is Björn's report is almost the final nail, not in the coffin, but in a great picture which we've now developed of Europe. And I think Björn's paper sums up the results of the country reports and makes reform proposals, not just for individual programs, because I think that the discussion we just had with Commissioner Schmit and also with Constanze Krehl shows how extremely complex and administrative and almost technocratic to a certain degree the cohesion policies and this whole context or framework is. And perhaps that's also part of the reason, or explains it to a certain degree, why the European Union isn't really taken or isn't really seen as an actor or as an active actor, because it seems to be very technocratic, administrative. That's the one side. So it's about the question of selling Europe properly, perhaps. But Björn also makes policy proposals how the context within which these programs are developed. So the macroeconomic policies, the wider economic policies, the wider trajectories, how they should change, and that's actually the starting point when we look at ways to influence regional development and to try and combat regional disparities. So today's conference has shown how important it is to look at the problem of regional disparities from a non-technocratic approach, even though that is very, very difficult. And one of the main aims of this project was to depict the socio-economic realities of people living in high growth or falling back regions. And our rather strange, or put it this way, our motley crew of countries we've chosen, with all they all have completely different experiences, historical experiences, but also traditions and development paths. Nevertheless, they still show similar patterns when it comes to regional disparities. And that's something which we found very fascinating on our journey from Northern Europe to Southern Europe to Central Europe. And it's these common patterns which actually made us quite pensive. And so on the one hand, we had growth, and we had high growth, and we had a robust labor market, almost in all cases restricted to a spatial or geographic minority. And these areas were in the capital areas, or were the commuter areas, the commuter belts around these capital cities or major cities of growth. And seeing that these areas were like inserted into the world economy with showing international high quality or high qualified labor markets which serviced international operating firms. And as a result, these regions have been able to prosper, and also reinforcing their success to a certain degree. But they're also to a certain degree now experiencing the downside of their success, is that many of these regions are faced with high cost of living and are also faced with the effects of social exclusion. And on the other hand, we found in all our countries, regions that have not been able to profit and to benefit from the growth process within the last 30 years, or be it even the 15 years. And so regions with higher unemployment, higher rates of poverty, lower levels of economic activity, and high degree of internal migration, people, the young and able, moving away, mostly to the prosperous areas. So, but these results would themselves actually be enough. But we actually also found that that the country's uneven development was also petering through to almost different political and cultural developments. So in some cases, so we measured voting turnout, for instance, and democratic activity was in all cases lower in the disadvantaged areas compared to the prospering regions. And at least for the case of Sweden, we just briefly talked about this, at least for the case of Sweden, there seemed to be we measured a correlation between the disadvantaged regions with a higher turnout for right-wing populist parties. So there seems to be a connection there, if it isn't the sole explaining factor. So this obviously means that social inequality has not only a spatial dimension, but also has a political dimension, potentially posing a threat to democratic institutions and processes. It doesn't necessarily have to be a right-wing populist movement, but it just really is enough that the people don't turn up to vote, which is our basic democratic right, and it's actually something which is the fuel for every democracy, is that the citizens actually go to vote. So what can we do? This is perhaps, I suppose we've seen it today as well, one of the toughest questions to answer, as there is no simple silver bullet. However, as Björn does show, in all cases, the municipality or local government should be the form of attention. And I think we also briefly talked about that when we talked about local capacities, developing their own visions, their own development plans, and bringing in the people. It's not something which you can do from outside. It's something which has to come from the areas themselves. And so the solution should be to involve or to empower local governments to pursue their own destinations by helping them free themselves from the vicious cycle of which Björn described, of low economic activity, high employment, and high local debt, which basically renders them ineffective and unable to free themselves. But enabling local government to reopen libraries, as you can perhaps picture it, or mending roads, or develop local business opportunities is only part of the story. I think what we also briefly touched on in the end of our discussion was that there should be more than just bringing the state back in and mixing the cement and opening services. That's part of the story. But it should also be about empowering the people who live in this area by creating so-called social spaces and to support the strengthening and development of democratic culture as a firewall against the anti-democratic vultures feeding off the feelings of dissatisfaction and alienation brought about regional imbalances. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, the solutions and policies designed to tackle the regional and social divide should aim to not only spread economic gains more evenly, but also to strengthen democracy. Now, I'd like to also, before I conclude, thank all the panelists taking part in today. So especially Maija and Cristina and Commissioner Schmit's team, and also thank you very much, Maria, for opening today's session. And thank you very much, Björn, for finishing this report and actually bearing with us like 48 hours before the report was published. Thank you very much for your expertise on that. And I'd also like to thank my friends and my colleagues from FEPS, Olian Omes and David Rinaldi for undertaking this project. And so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us. And I wish you a great evening and hope to hear and see from you soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.